Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a real textual detective story. We're embarking on a totally fascinating historical and linguistic investigation into one of the most widely read and, honestly, fiercely debated texts in human history. We're going to become textual detectives, peeling back the layers on the ancient origins of the Quran. We'll be looking through the lens of modern philology, manuscript evidence, and historical critical scholarship. If you're into history, ancient languages, and unraveling centuries-old mysteries, you are absolutely in the right place. Because what we find here might just change how we view the history of world religions.
So it all starts with one massive, profound question. How exactly do you decode a 1,300-year-old text? You know, when you're dealing with ancient manuscripts, peeling back the centuries isn't just about reading words on a faded page. It's really about understanding the entire world in which those words were first written, spoken, and shared.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's the roadmap for our investigation today. We'll start with 1, the standard Islamic narrative, then move to 2, decoding the bare consonants, jump into 3, the Syro-Aramaic subtext, explore 4, foreign words and shared stories, and finally wrap up with 5, alliteration versus incarnation.
Starting right off with Section 1, the standard Islamic narrative, the traditional framework of preservation.
To really grasp the depth of this debate, we've got to understand two totally contrasting paradigms. For over 13 centuries, the standard Islamic narrative has maintained that the text was dictated verbatim to Muhammad in the 7th century Meccan dialect of the Quraysh tribe. It asserts that this text was perfectly standardized by Caliph Uthman, essentially preserving the eternal speech of God with absolute letter-perfect uniformity. But in stark contrast, modern historical critical scholars insist on comparing those early manuscripts against the actual, messy linguistic environment of late antiquity. And what they find isn't an isolated desert origin, but rather a text emerging from a highly complex, plurilingual melting pot.
Moving right along to Section 2, decoding the bare consonants, the mystery of the early manuscripts. And that brings us to a concept called the Rasm. The earliest surviving manuscripts were written in what scholars call Scriptio Defectiva. Actually, think of it more like a bare consonantal skeleton. They used just 16 distinct shapes to represent 28 different sounds. Imagine that. There are no short vowel markers, no diacritical dots. Because a single shape could represent multiple letters, the text was incredibly ambiguous. Without those little dots, which, by the way, were systematically added centuries later, about 20 to 25% of the text forms what's called dark passages. These are sections that are literally unintelligible if you just rely on classical Arabic.
This is exactly where researchers like Mark Bates step in. Bates evaluates the pioneering work of modern philologists who are trying to solve the mystery of these dark passages. The goal here is to conceptually strip away the later 9th and 10th century interpretations, which is definitely no easy feat, and look at the text purely as an artifact of its own time, deeply embedded in that late antique environment we just talked about.
All right, Section 3, the Syro-Aramaic subtext, cracking the linguistic code.
So how do you actually crack this code? Well, German philologist Günter Lüling developed a really rigorous, though highly debated, 4-step methodology for this. First, he isolated those opaque Arabic terms that completely baffled traditional commentators. Second, he conceptually stripped away all the later Islamic dots and vowels, getting right back to that bare Rasm. Third, he applied 4th to 6th century Syro-Aramaic roots and alternative diacritical dots. Syro-Aramaic was, after all, the dominant liturgical language of the era. Finally, he retranslated the text. And the result? Lüling argued that he uncovered underlying pre-Islamic Christian strophic hymns hidden right there in the text. Now, while mainstream scholarship views his claim of a wholesale Christian hymnal as a bit of an overreach, his method absolutely blew the doors wide open for a whole new kind of linguistic analysis.
Building on that exact method, the philologist Christoph Luxenberg found some incredible aha moments. Let's take the famous term hurin. The traditional Arabic reading translates this as the white-eyed virgins of paradise. But when Luxemburg shifted the linguistic lens and read the bare Rasm through Syro-Aramaic, matching it against the 4th century hymns of St. Ephrem the Syrian, the imagery changed entirely. The Syro-Aramaic roots actually translate to white, translucent, crystal-clear grapes offered as heavenly refreshment. I mean, talk about a sudden change to the heavenly menu, right? It completely shifts a sensual probus into an agricultural heavenly one just by changing the linguistic lens.
Section 4, Foreign Words and Shared Stories, the Intertextual Tapestry.
Now, we kind of have to start here with the text's own claim about itself. Surah 16, verse 103, explicitly asserts that it was revealed in a pure, clear Arabic tongue. It presents itself to the reader as an isolated, pristine Arabic revelation. But, as we'll see, the historical evidence points to a massive contrast.
Arthur Jeffery's foundational 1938 catalog brilliantly illustrates this. He identified over 200 non-Arabic terms embedded right in the text. And we aren't just talking about everyday trade words for spices or fabrics. These are central, heavy-hitting theological concepts. The word for gospel comes from Greek via Syriac. Torah comes from Hebrew and Aramaic. Paradise has Persian roots. It turns out the text relies heavily on the technical theological lexicons of neighboring Christian, Jewish, and Zoroastrian cultures.
And it isn't just the vocabulary, it's the stories themselves. Source criticism reveals that the text participates in a deeply shared late antique storytelling environment. For example, the story of a raven teaching Cain how to bury Abel, that doesn't actually appear in the biblical book of Genesis. Instead, it tracks back to Jewish rabbinic traditions like the Pirke De-Rabbi Eliezer, which were circulating centuries earlier. And the narratives of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, or Abraham being delivered from the fire, they closely echo Talmudic fables or midrashic expansions, which are basically ancient Jewish commentaries that were widely shared at the time. It really is a rich intertextual tapestry.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, Inliberation versus Incarnation, the macro-theological implications. When you combine this granular historical data with the text's own internal claims, it creates what the source material refers to as the Islamic Dilemma. Critics point out that the text explicitly affirms the divine inspiration and binding authority of the prior biblical scriptures possessed by 7th century Jews and Christians. But here's the catch. They argue that the extant biblical texts of that exact era directly contradict the Quran's core claims, particularly regarding things like the crucifixion and divinity of Christ. So the dilemma presented by these scholars is this. If the previous scriptures are preserved, their claims are true, making the later text false. But if they are corrupted, then the text is commanding adherence to a forged document, which would also render its guidance false. It really highlights a serious tension of self-referential incoherence.
The source material also highlights what it views as a massive category error in theological debates, contrasting the Islamic paradigm directly with the biblical paradigm. In Islam, the primary revelation is a book. This is the doctrine of Inliberation, literally the word-made book. Under this framework, because Islam relies on a dictation model of a perfect celestial text, scholars argue that any historical textual fluidity threatens the entire system. Conversely, under the Christian paradigm, the primary revelation is a person. That's the doctrine of Incarnation, the Word made flesh. The scriptures are the inspired historical witness to that person. Because the faith is anchored in a historical event, scholars note that minor copyist variants don't compromise the core dogma, they just naturally reflect a historically grounded human transmission.
Scholar Walter C. Kaiser Jr. calls this alternative the promise plan framework. Through this lens, biblical theology doesn't rely on a mechanically dictated book dropped from heaven. Instead, it's viewed as this organic, historically grounded promise that unfolds progressively over centuries. It moves from the early covenants through the Davidic kingship and the New Covenant oracles, ultimately climaxing in the incarnation of the first century. It's presented as a unified trajectory that builds on history, rather than claiming to abrogate or overwrite it with a newly dictated manuscript.
So what does this all mean for us? After exploring the Syro-Aramaic roots, those ambiguous bare consonants, and the massively shared late antique environment, we are left with a profoundly deep question regarding the nature of revelation itself. Does absolute divine authority require a mechanically flawless, dictated manuscript, or does it rest upon a historically faithful, organically unfolding promise? It's a question that challenges us to look way beyond the ink on the page and consider the very fabric of history. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.